Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today I wanted to do a special video, a different sort of video than some of the ones that I have done in the past. I had time in between other projects, and I've had interest in doing something like this for a little while now. So I wanted to give my predictions for the nominees for the Game Awards, specifically for two categories, because there are plenty of categories that I just don't have enough expertise in to make an educated guess on. But for RPG of the Year and for Game of the Year, I think I can put something together. I do apologize if my voice sounds a little weird. I am currently recovering from being sick. It shouldn't cause too much of an issue as I try to talk about the RPGs and all of these. So as you can see, I've got this in tier maker right here, and there are 4 categories I'm going to be sorting these games into. Certain, these are the games that I would place money on, and if you let me place money on them, I would start planning how I was going to spend that money I would be getting back. Good likelihood, I think these ones are most likely going to be in the category as well. I'm not guaranteeing them, but I would probably be surprised if they were not included. Dark horses, these are the ones that could spoil things on my general predictions, ones that I don't think are going to be in the category, but are definitely going to be considered, and also give the reasons why I don't think they're likely to either. And the last one is to be seen. There's at least one game that I simply cannot give an opinion on yet, but there's a possibility. And this tier maker one is for the RPG Game of the Year. I'll get into the Game of the Year ones later on, but we're starting with RPG of the Year, and we are starting with the certain ones. There are 2 games that I think are absolutely certain they're going to be nominated. I would be absolutely shocked if they were not, and I think it's pretty easy to start off with Baldur's Gate 3. There we go. Baldur's Gate 3, the newest game from Larian Studios, who also have done Divinity Original Sin. I've personally played through Divinity Original Sin 2, very good game, but I have not played Baldur's Gate 3. That's actually going to be a theme in this. There's a few ones that I just have not played, but I am, of course, aware of them. Baldur's Gate 3, amazing reception. We're talking one of the highest critical scores I have ever seen in any game, along with incredible sales numbers. It is continually brought up as one of the best games, not just of this year, but of the last decade. It is a true RPG. It is one of those games that you think of when you think of a role-playing game. And the combination of Larian Studios, who are generally well received to begin with and have a relationship with the Game Awards, they were nominated for RPG of the Year for Divinity Original Sin 2. And I think that studio relationship is going to be a factor in the choices of the nominees when there's not games that are going to stand out above everything else. Those relationships are going to help them. Baldur's Gate 3 does not need that. Baldur's Gate 3 is going to get in on its own merits. It's just an incredible game from everything that I have heard, and it's a no-brainer. That's a complete no-brainer. I also think that Baldur's Gate 3 is the most likely winner of this category. I would be surprised if one of these other games tops it. But the other game that is going to be certain in the nominees is another game from a studio that the Game Awards very much likes, especially for this category, and that is Final Fantasy XVI, the newest in the incredibly genre-defining fantasy role-playing games. This is a no-brainer. Final Fantasy XVI was well received, it sold well despite being a console exclusive, and was generally seen as a return to form for the series. Now again, haven't played Final Fantasy XVI. I know a lot of people love it. I also know some people who are a little underwhelmed by it, but you can take it as granted that this game is going to be there. Square Enix has, I believe, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, more years of getting multiple nominations in this category than having no nominations. The RPG of the year basically has a reserved spot for at least one Square Enix game. It's just how it goes. This is what this company does. Final Fantasy XVI is the RPG for Square Enix this year. And next year I will bet right now that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is going to be this same role for next year. But those are the two absolute certainties. Larian Studios and Square Enix are well received. They have a well-received game out that sold incredibly well as well. That's just a no-brainer for getting these nominations. Now, next up, in the good likelihood, this is where we've got some ones that are a little more tenuous, ones that I predict to be there, but could even fall short, potentially. But this next one is a really big release. This is another console exclusive, another game that's from a studio that the Game Awards has in the past really liked in this category, and that is Starfield. Starfield is in the good likelihood. Now, the reason it's not in certain is, one, while Fallout 4 made it into the RPG category, they're sometimes nebulous on what counts as RPG and what doesn't. I think Starfield does. I think Starfield's going to be a contender for this category. But then the second is that relative to the rest of the category, relative to the other nominees, Starfield wasn't as well received. We're talking the OpenCritic, Metacritic more in the mid-80s, as opposed to Baldur's Gate, which was high 90s, and Final Fantasy XVI, which was high 80s. It's not unheard of for a game in that range to get nominated for different categories, but this is a very competitive year on multiple fronts. But here's what I think Starfield has going for it. It was generally well received. It sold incredibly well. It is by Bethesda. The Game Awards likes Bethesda, and this is the first time we've got the really big release after Microsoft bought Bethesda. Microsoft really wants people to get Starfield, and they're going to be pushing for this to get nominated in numerous spots, and the RPG of the Year category is definitely one of those. I think that regardless of the merits of the game versus the other games that are on this list, it's gonna be difficult to fight back against the combined power of Bethesda and Microsoft, and that's going to get Starfield a nomination. And generally, I think people pretty much liked Starfield. I don't think there's gonna be too much anger that Starfield gets nominated. Next up, and this is one that I think might get a little more heat for getting nominated, but it was at least initially well received on the critical and the general sales side of things, and is again from a really big studio. We're talking about Diablo 4. Diablo 4, the big new release. It's been a long time since this series had a proper release, and not, the stupid mobile game. And it came out and it did pretty well. Now, I do think it's kind of faded from the public consciousness since its release in a way that Starfield, Final Fantasy XVI, and Baldur's Gate 3 certainly have not. And then you've got the part where when it did come back to the public consciousness, it wasn't in a good way. So if there was one game from this category that I feel like is most likely to be supplanted, it's Diablo 4. And that's partially because, and deservedly so, Activision Blizzard is going to have a little more scrutiny put on them as a studio due to the general misconduct and the awful things they have allowed to happen on the company's watch. I don't think that's going to be enough to take away that Diablo 4 is generally regarded as a good game. Now, I don't think Diablo 4 is going to be anywhere close to winning this category, but getting that nomination, I think, is going to be big for Activision Blizzard, and we'll just have to see how things play out. The next one is the first one that I have actually played in this category, and that is Sea of Stars, Sabotage Studios' newest game, made with a collaboration on some of the music with Yasunori Mitsuda. Very well received game, sold quite well for an indie title, and that's where I think the rub is. I think the Game Awards likes having indie games in the category to give more credence, so it's not just the big releases. And Sea of Stars is the obvious candidate for this. We also have the Game Awards having a good relationship with Sabotage Studios from the last game. They had The Messenger, which won the new debut game for a studio back when it released. And so Sea of Stars is regarded as a very good game. It sold well. Sabotage Studio is well liked by the Game Awards, and I think it would make the Game Awards look good to have Sea of Stars in the nominees. And I think some people have used that to argue that Sea of Stars should be in the Game of the Year category. That strikes me as a lot more unlikely a prospect, but for RPG of the Year, and certainly for Indie Game of the Year, I expect Sea of Stars to land in the categories. So let's talk about the dark horses. If one of these games falters, who could pick up the slack? And this next one is one that I considered kind of supplanting Starfield in this, because I see them as pretty similar. They're both games that had good but not amazing critical reception. They sold incredibly well, and here's the difference between them and why I think Starfield's more likely than this one. And that's the Bethesda and the Microsoft side of things, because Bethesda, they have the good relationship, and Microsoft really wants to push this as a console exclusive. Hogwarts Legacy is not a console exclusive. There's no bigger company that's going to be pushing it. And certainly Warner Brothers Games is going to want to push it in various categories, but I think when it comes to that, the combined power of Bethesda and Microsoft is going to make Starfield the more likely candidate. Starfield, I think, does a lot more new, a lot more exciting for them to show off than Hogwarts Legacy. And certainly it could supplant Diablo 4 or Sea of Stars, but I think Sea of Stars, especially, they want to keep that indie cred. They're going to keep that in there. Diablo 4, another one that could be supplanted by Hogwarts Legacy. You've got to have the controversy either way with those two nominees. I have my personal opinions. I did not get the game, so I don't know exactly how it is in comparison to the other games as games, but it sold really well. It was pretty well received critically, so I wouldn't be shocked, but I am putting it in the Dark Horse category because I don't think it has enough. I think it needed to either be an even bigger success, have an even bigger name behind it, or needed to be more critically well received. And the second Dark Horse candidate I have is another Square Enix game. And I think that this game actually kind of suffers because Final Fantasy XVI is going to take a lot of the Square Enix RPG attention away from it, and it then struggles in comparison to the other games. In years like last year, when we had Triangle Strategy and Live Alive nominated for RPG of the Year, there weren't as many big candidates to fight with in there. And I think the RPG of the Year is just too competitive for Octopath Traveler 2 to get nominated, which is honestly disappointing because of all the games I've talked about right now, I've enjoyed Octopath Traveler 2 the most, so that's just me. You might see it nominated in my Game of the Year categories, but in this one, I think there's too much competition, and that Square Enix reserve spot is going to Final Fantasy XVI. So the final one is the To Be Seen category, and that is just a single game that I just can't exclude from the conversation because it hasn't come out, but it also is such a big release and it could do really well, and that is the Super Mario RPG remake. There is a lot that could go right for this. If it really does set the world on fire, I could be persuaded that it lands in this category, but we're going to know the nominees before the game even comes out. So I don't know how likely it is on that front. I think they have nominated games in the past to have released after the nominees were revealed, but I can't do anything about that. I have not played Super Mario RPG. It is an incredibly well-received game back on the SNES. It's very well regarded. The remake seems to be doing the right things, pulling the right levers, and Nintendo's been on a roll this year, so I wouldn't bet against them, but I also can't bet for them because of all the unknown factors. So those are the games there, and I know there's plenty of great RPGs that are not even going to be considered in this. I would love if the Trail series could ever get recognition. Trails into Reverie came out this year, Legend of Nyata, Trails to Azure, all of them would have been great. Star Ocean Second Story R came out and was well received, but I think it runs into the exact same problem as Octopath Traveler 2, and that's just how it goes. There's a lot of competition and a lot of good games. So what do you think for the RPG Games of the Year? I'm going to move over to the Game of the Year award. Okay, and now we get into the second half of the video where I talk about the Game of the Year contenders. So there are 4 categories again for this one. One of them has changed. Certain Good Likelihood and Dark Horses are the same, but the third category, Good Contenders But, are games that I think would be nominated if they didn't have competition from within their own company. And I'll get into those, obviously, when we come there, but we'll start off with the certain ones. There are a few absolutely certain. I say a few, there are 2. The first one, it's not going to surprise you. I was talking about it in the RPG one. It's Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate 3, very well received, incredibly well selling. I can't see it not being here. I believe it to be a strong contender for the Game of the Year in general. In fact, I think it's really down to just 2 games that can realistically win the Game of the Year this year, and that is Baldur's Gate 3 and The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. I don't know why it's doing that on the tier maker, but, we now can, see them adjusted like that. Tears of the Kingdom, sequel to Breath of the Wild, which was the Game of the Year winner back in 2017, I believe. And Tears of the Kingdom was as equally well received, incredibly well selling. Nintendo is behind it. Nintendo hasn't won the Game of the Year since Breath of the Wild, and I think that they probably feel like their time is due and they're willing to put their money where their mouth is to make it happen. I think that Zelda would be nominated regardless of what Nintendo did on that front, but there's just no way Tears of the Kingdom is not going to be nominated, and I think that it is also a very good contender for the award itself. So those are the 2 that are absolutely certain. You can put money on it. If I could, I would. Next up is the Good Likelihood. These are the ones that I do expect to be nominated, but I wouldn't be shocked if they didn't end up there. And so I've talked about major exclusives from Xbox and from Nintendo, from the Switch already. And I talked about Final Fantasy XVI as the PlayStation exclusive, but I think Sony would like their Game of the Year nominee to be a platform exclusive and coming from one of their studios, and so I think that Spider-Man 2 is a pretty good chance of getting a Game of the Year nomination. Spider-Man 1 was well received and nominated for various categories at the Game Awards when it came out, and Spider-Man 2 looks just as good, had great reception, good sales, all of the hallmarks of a good contender, and Sony will love if they can get a Game of the Year nomination for this game, and I think it is probably the strongest contender of all of the Sony PlayStation console exclusives. And I think that's going to be a theme of this year, is that the big 3 are going to push their console exclusives to try and get nominations, even if I think that there's a distinct possibility that none of their console exclusives will win. But Spider-Man 2 has the right people behind it. Insomniac is well liked. Sony has the power and the influence. I think it's a very good contender. Next up, and this is one that's a company that's been on quite the win streak, I'd say, this year and the last few years. And this game, incredibly well received, incredibly well selling. You've heard that a lot from me already, but this one has the special added bonus of being a remake of an already beloved game, and I think that is going to score points. And so Resident Evil 4 is also in my good likelihood. I expect it to be nominated for Game of the Year. Resident Evil 2 Remake, when it came out, was nominated for Game of the Year. I don't believe 3 was, but all of these Capcom remakes of the Resident Evil franchise have been well received, and 4 is the best one since 2. I think that Capcom has been on a roll recently, and that's going to translate to results in this particular instance. Next up, we have Starfield again. Yeah, I think Starfield's a good likelihood for RPG and Game of the Year. And I think that this one is not as justifiable as the RPG one. I think there are plenty of games that are better than Starfield, but Starfield has Bethesda behind it, it has Microsoft behind it, it has the sales behind it, and I think that's going to be enough to get Starfield nominated. I think with Nintendo having Tears of the Kingdom, with Sony having Spider-Man 2, Microsoft's going to be looking for their console exclusive to get into the Game of the Year conversation, and Starfield is the one. So those are the 5, but as you might remember, recently they expanded the Game of the Year nominees to 6 instead of 5. So this would be my pick for 5, but there is a 6th that's going to get nominated that's not among these, and not counting, if I'm wrong about any of these. So the good contenders, but these are the ones that, if there was not a game already on here that I think is going to be nominated, this would be the game that's going to be there. And I'll start with Nintendo, because Zelda is going to be nominated. I am certain of that. But Nintendo also makes good games beyond that. They had a pretty good year. Pikmin 4 came out this year. Fire Emblem Engage came out this year. I don't think either of them are even in my dark horses, but one that is going to be not a dark horse, but a good contender, but is Super Mario Bros. Wonder. The first proper new 2D Mario in a long time, and say it again, it had amazing sales, it had great critical reception, and the only reason it is not already in my certain list is because of Zelda, is because I'm not sure if the Game Awards want to give multiple nominations to the same company. Now, granted, it has happened before, but Nintendo did it in 2017 with Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey. Both were nominated for Game of the Year, but this is a very competitive year. I don't think it is just a guarantee. Another game from another company that is already on here that was very well received, and I think if I was picking, I might kick off Starfield to put this game on there, because I think that this genre hasn't gotten the recognition that it deserves, and Street Fighter 6 has been one of the biggest fighting game releases since, I'd say, Smash Bros. Ultimate. And I say that as a casual fan who does not play fighting games. I know how well Street Fighter 6 was regarded, but I think it's in this category. It would have been in the nominees if it wasn't for Resident Evil 4. I think that they do not want to give Capcom 2 Game of the Year nominees in such a competitive year. And I also think if they're gonna give 2 to any company, it's probably gonna be Nintendo over Capcom. They have never given 2 nominees for Game of the Year to a company that's just a general developer and publisher and not a platform holder. That's never happened before, and I don't think this is the year that's going to break it. But Street Fighter 6 is a very good game. It deserves quite a bit of recognition. I think it will deserve more recognition than it ends up getting, even though it will win the fighting game of the year. That's my bonus prediction here. But Resident Evil 4 is going to be the pick from Capcom. And the next one, and this one's a little bit under the radar, I'd say, is a second Microsoft game. Now, Starfield, again, I think is the one that's going to get it because it's such a big game, because it's Bethesda, because Microsoft really wants to put resources behind it. But Hi-Fi Rush was really well received when it came out, and is a platform exclusive. So I would love if Hi-Fi Rush got the recognition over Starfield. I just don't think it's gonna happen. This is not a game that Microsoft is clearly going to invest as much time and effort into getting recognition, because they didn't even do it when it was releasing to begin with. It was a freaking shadow drop and did so well because of word of mouth. So I would love if it got recognition for that. I just don't think that's going to happen. But if Starfield wasn't there, this is the game that I think would be most likely to replace it as Microsoft's entry onto Game of the Year category. So then we're going to move on to Dark Horses. We've got a few here, and some of them I've talked about already. We're going to start with Final Fantasy XVI. Square Enix is a beloved company. It has a lot of good games. Final Fantasy is a classic series. Final Fantasy XVI was a good game, but I don't think that's going to cut it this year. I don't think good is enough. I think they need to be amazing, blow you out of the water great, and I don't think Final Fantasy XVI got to that point. It is still a very well-received game, and the company is well-regarded, so I wouldn't be completely shocked if it ended up here. Next up, Diablo 4. Diablo 4 has the same deal. They have a very good game, a classic series, newest game in that, return to form in some ways. I don't think it's enough. I don't think it wowed people enough, and recent more negative press around it definitely hindered any attempt they had of getting it to the Game of the Year. Hogwarts Legacy, very well selling, well received in comparison to most games. But this one, I think there's just too many games in front of it. I don't think Hogwarts Legacy has enough behind it to leapfrog better games, because every single game that I have listed out here, apart from Starfield, had better critical reception than Hogwarts Legacy. And that's just how it goes sometimes. Sometimes you just run into a year where there's gotta be a lot of competition. Speaking of a lot of competition, Dead Space Remake is another very well-received game. It was a remake of a classic horror game that seemed to get things right in the remake process, but it's not Resident Evil 4, and I don't think they're gonna nominate two games like this, and I think Resident Evil 4 is the better game. So Dead Space kind of loses out in part because Resident Evil 4 came out. It might be unfair, but that's just how it goes, and I think there's a similar deal with Alan Wake 2, one of the more recent games releasing, and again, very well received. I think that in another year, Alan Wake 2 could be a distinct Game of the Year contender. But this isn't that year. This is a really competitive year. And that's it. Those are the games that I think have a chance. And there are still several big releases that I did not include here. There's Armored Core 6. There's Star Wars Jedi Survivor. There are a lot of good games this year, so I would be willing to hear arguments for a lot of different games. As you may see, I still only listed 5 in the good likelihood or certain categories. So what is the 6th game? Among the good contenders, or the dark horses, what is the game that I think gets that 6th slot? And I think it's Super Mario Bros. Wonder. It's probably the best received among those. Street Fighter 6 might be on the same level, but again, Nintendo is going to have more sway than Capcom, I would say. And the Mario series is a classic. They have nominated a Mario and Zelda game in the same year before, and I think that's gonna happen again this year. So that's my prediction. Baldur's Gate 3, Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Spider-Man 2, Resident Evil 4, Starfield, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder are going to be the nominees for Game of the Year. So, let me know what you think. I enjoyed talking about this. I hope it wasn't too rambly and was somewhat coherent in my thoughts. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the nominees are on the 13th. And you can let me know your own predictions in the comments. Maybe I'll come back to this and see just how wrong I was, or I can start a new channel on prognostication of awards for the games. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Leave a like if you did, comment below your predictions, subscribe for more game content. Probably not things like this, but you never know. I've got some ideas, and I've had fun with this unscripted video, which is the first in a long time for me. Have a great day, and happy gaming.